The heavy thud of gold coins hitting a wooden table echoes against the stone walls. The year is 193 CE, and from the ramparts of the Castra Praetoria, a soldier looks down at the trembling senators below, shouting a price. He is not selling a slave or a horse. He is selling the Roman Empire itself to the highest bidder. This was the Praetorian Guard, established by Augustus as a loyal shield, which evolved into a dangerous political mafia that assassinated emperors more often than they saved them. For 3 centuries, the Praetorian Guard stood as the ultimate paradox of power, an elite force created to shield the emperor that eventually became his most dangerous enemy. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we open the gates of the Castra Praetoria to uncover how these elite protectors of the Julian line turned the throne into a commodity, forcing frontier generals to march on Rome in the ancient world's deadliest battle royale. To understand this descent into treason, we must look to the architect of the empire itself. Augustus walked a political tightrope that would have sliced a lesser man to ribbons. He was the master of the Roman world, yet he remembered vividly how his great-uncle Julius Caesar had been butchered on the Senate floor precisely because he flaunted his power too openly. Augustus needed steel between his skin and the daggers of Rome, but he could not afford to look like a tyrant surrounded by mercenaries. His solution was a masterstroke of political camouflage. He formalized the cohors Praetoria. In the days of the Republic, a Praetorian cohort was merely a temporary bodyguard unit for a general in the field. Augustus transformed this concept into a permanent, elite institution, raising 9 cohorts that totaled roughly 4,500 to 9,000 men. These were not common legionaries. They were recruited exclusively from the heartland of Italy, men of imposing physical stature and unquestionable loyalty to the Julian line. They represented the peak of Roman martial discipline, receiving double the pay of a regular soldier and serving shorter terms. However, the emperor was cunning, knowing that the sight of thousands of armored soldiers marching through the Forum would provoke the Senate and terrify the populace. Therefore, he stationed only 3 cohorts within the city itself, scattering the rest in the neighboring towns of Italy. Inside Rome, they were shadows, often wearing heavy woolen togas over their armor to conceal their weapons. Their presence betrayed only by the rhythmic, disciplined crunch of hobnailed sandals on the cobblestones. They were everywhere, watching, listening, and enforcing the emperor's will with silent brutality. To the public, they were the guardians of the Pax Romana. To the aristocracy, they were a silent threat, ensuring no one dared speak too loudly against the princeps. Augustus believed he had created a loyal shield, keeping them scattered to limit their collective power and ensuring no single commander could wield them against him. But his successor, Tiberius, would make a decision that brought the wolves right into the sheepfold. If Augustus was the careful architect who designed the Praetorian Guard to be invisible, Lucius Aelius Sejanus was the ambitious engineer who turned it into a monolith of intimidation. As the Praetorian prefect under Emperor Tiberius, Sejanus recognized that dispersed power is weak power. In 23 CE, he convinced the emperor that for the sake of discipline and rapid response, the 9 cohorts scattered across Italy needed a single home. The result was the construction of the Castra Praetoria on the Viminal Hill, a citadel of brick and concrete, fortified with high walls that dominated the eastern skyline of the city. For the first time, the Senate and the people of Rome had to live with the permanent, physical reminder that their freedom existed only by the sufferance of armed men. The psychological impact was immediate, as the distinct and rhythmic thunder of thousands of hobnailed boots marching in unison on Roman cobblestones, became the new soundtrack of the Capitol, signaling the end of the Senate's authority and the rise of the sword. When Tiberius retreated to the island of Capri in 26 CE, consumed by paranoia and weary of governance, the Castra Praetoria effectively became the true seat of government. Sejanus now controlled the flow of information to the emperor and held the only keys to the palace. In this vacuum, the loyalty of the soldiers shifted away from the distant princeps on an island. They looked to the man who walked among them, paid them, and commanded them from the fortress on the hill. Although Sejanus was eventually executed in a brutal purge when Tiberius realized the depth of his ambition, as the lesson remained, the man who holds the guard holds the city. And soon, they would not just protect emperors, they would start selecting them. On January 24th, 41 CE, the illusion of the Praetorian Guard as mere protectors was shattered in the dim, echoing silence of a palace cryptoporticus. In a narrow underground corridor, the tribune Cassius Chaerea decided that the dignity of a Roman soldier outweighed his oath of loyalty. As Emperor Caligula separated from his entourage to take a shortcut, the air suddenly grew heavy with the metallic scent of drawn iron. Chaerea struck first, his blade biting deep between the emperor's neck and shoulder, crying out the ritual sacrificial command, "Receive your due." Within moments, other conspirators descended, turning the ruler of the known world into a mangled corpse with flashing daggers. The guard had not just failed to protect the emperor, they had executed him. While the Senate hurriedly convened to debate the restoration of the Republic, roaming Praetorians looted the palace. Behind a trembling curtain, a soldier noticed a pair of feet and pulled back the fabric to reveal Claudius, Caligula's uncle, a man long dismissed as a stuttering invalid. Expecting execution, Claudius fell to his knees, but instead of a sword, the soldier offered a salute, hailing him as Caesar. The Praetorians quickly realized a terrifying truth. Without an emperor, there was no need for an imperial guard, and to survive, they needed a puppet. To secure his life and his throne, Claudius promised each man a donativum, a massive bribe of 15,000 sestertii, equivalent to several years of pay. This was the moment loyalty transformed into a transaction. The throne of Augustus was no longer a divine right or a senatorial mandate. It was a commodity purchased with gold and guaranteed by the sword. The Senate was paralyzed, forced to accept the soldier's choice or face annihilation. The Praetorians had chosen the ruler, effectively ending the Senate's political relevance. But this bold extortion was only the beginning of their insatiable greed. By 68 CE, the Praetorian Guard believed they held the monopoly on imperial power, setting the stage for the most catastrophic period in early imperial history. A chilling, wet gasp tears through the silence of a dim villa outside Rome. It is the sound of a dynasty dying, followed by a dagger dropping to the stone floor with a metallic clatter and the heavy thud of a body. A servant weeps over the bleeding corpse of a 30-year-old man who, just moments before, was the master of the known world. In that subterranean room of a freedman's villa on June 9th, 68 CE, Nero, the last of the Julio Claudians, faced the end. Declared a public enemy by the Senate, he heard the thundering hooves of the Praetorian Guard approaching to drag him to the forum for a slave's execution, to be whipped to death. With a final theatrical lament for the artist the world was losing, he drove a dagger into his throat, though his hand was so unsteady that his scribe, Epaphroditus, had to push the blade home. When the centurion burst through the door moments later, attempting to staunch the wound with his cloak to take the emperor alive, Nero looked up with glazing eyes and gasped his final delusional words. Too late. This is fidelity. The guard had betrayed Nero, allowing him to take his own life. His death sent a shockwave through the city that was initially mistaken for liberation. In the Senate House, the air smelled not of incense, but of hysterical relief. Senators donned liberty caps, overturned Nero's statues, and frantically declared Galba, the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, as the new Caesar. They believed the nightmare was over, and that power had returned to the Curia, to the laws, to the men in togas who debated in the Forum. They were catastrophically wrong, for with the death of Nero, Rome did not find the freedom it prayed for. It found a nightmare. Nero's suicide had revealed a terrifying truth, one that the historian Tacitus would later call the secret of empire, that an emperor could be made elsewhere than at Rome. But the true power did not lie in the marble halls of the Senate, but in the calloused hands of the legions stationed on the frontiers. The vacuum left by Nero did not create a republic. It created a free-for-all, where any general with enough troops and enough ambition could stake a claim to the throne. In the span of a single year, the sun would rise on 4 different emperors. 3 would be butchered, their bodies dragged through the streets, or left to rot in the mud of the Po River. For the first time in a century, the terrified Senate and the citizens of Rome were forced to confront a truth they had long ignored. The power of the empire rested on the blood-stained swords of the legions. Galba marched toward the capital. An old man of 71 carried on a litter, bringing with him a reputation for severe, archaic discipline. He entered Rome not as a liberator, but as a living fossil of a dead republic, his hands twisted by arthritis, and his face permanently etched with a scowl of disapproval. He immediately suspended the public games and executed many of Nero's servants, alienating the populace who missed the spectacle. But his fatal mistake occurred when the Praetorian Guard respectfully requested their promised bonus. Nymphidius Sabinus, their commander, had promised them 30,000 sesterces per man to betray Nero. Galba looked down from his tribunal, his voice raspy but firm, and delivered a sentence that would be his death warrant. "I choose my soldiers. I do not buy them." It was a magnificent sentiment of ancient Roman virtue, but to men who held swords, lived in barracks, and expected their payout, it was a deadly insult. And Galba believed he was restoring discipline. In reality, he was signing his own execution order. The guard's loyalty, long ago untethered from duty, evaporated instantly. Watching from the shadows was Marcus Salvius Otho. Once Nero's closest drinking companion, Otho was 36, charming, and drowning in debts totaling 200 million sesterces. For Otho, the throne was not just an ambition, it was his only escape from bankruptcy and exile. He understood what Galba did not. Loyalty in 69 CE was a commodity. While Galba slept, believing his severity had cowed the troops, Otho worked, buying the loyalty of 23 key officers with a few handfuls of gold and promises of future wealth. The infection of mutiny spread through the barracks like a fever in the winter cold. On the morning of January 15th, 69 CE, under a gloomy sky, Noel Galba was offering sacrifices at the Temple of Apollo, ignoring the haruspices who warned him from reading the entrails of a bull that murder lurked in his own house. By noon, Otho had been smuggled into the Praetorian camp inside a closed litter and hailed as emperor, while Galba, confused by conflicting rumors and bad advice, was carried into the Roman Forum. The streets were packed with terrified citizens until a troop of cavalry charged into the Forum, scattering the civilians. Galba's litter-bearers panicked and dumped the emperor onto the stones near the Lacus Curtius. In the heart of the Roman Forum, a cohort of Praetorians surrounded the emperor's litter, not to protect him, but to butcher him. The old man, clad in a linen cuirass that offered no protection against gladius steel, offered his neck, shouting, Strike, if it be for the good of Rome.
No, Centurion, wait.
A soldier named Camurius drove a sword deep into his throat, and the rest of the squad fell upon him, hacking at his legs and arms. When the butchery was done, a soldier cut off Galba's head. Because the emperor was bald and there was no hair to grip, the killer thrust his thumb into the dead man's mouth, parading the grisly trophy on a spear through the streets to present it to Otho. It was a brutal public execution that signaled to the world that the emperor was no longer sacred, but merely a tenant evicted at the guard's pleasure. Otho was now master of Rome, wiping the blood from his hands, but a terrifying message arrived from the frozen north. The Rhine legions were marching. While the Praetorians were busy auctioning their loyalty to Otho with the flash of gold coins, you see, the hardened legions on the Rhine frontier declared their own general, Aulus Vitellius, as emperor. The snows of the Alps had barely melted when the reality of civil war descended upon the serene vineyards of northern Italy. The legions of the Rhine, the most battle-hardened force in the empire, were descending into Italy like an avalanche. These were not the manicured soldiers of the capital, whose armor shone for parades and whose skin was softened by the baths. These were men of the frontier, their lorica segmentata stained with the rust of the damp north and the mud of Germanic forests. Otho, the man who had seized the throne through blood in the Forum, now faced a grim calculus. His most experienced generals, including the famous Suetonius Paulinus, urged patience, in advising him to wait for the legions marching from the Danube to bolster his ranks and to let the enemy tire themselves out in the difficult terrain. But Otho, racked by nervous energy and listening to the sycophantic urgency of inexperienced courtiers, ordered an immediate attack, committing a fatal strategic error. On April 14th, near the village of Bedriacum, the two massive Roman hosts collided. The inevitable collision laid bare the disparity between the palace soldiers and the frontier wolves. The Vitellian forces slammed into Otho's army with the force of a battering ram. The fighting was not the disciplined chess match of a foreign campaign. It was a chaotic, heaving scrum in the mud, where men recognized the faces of friends across the shield wall before driving gladi into their throats. The Praetorian Guard, Otho's elite enforcement arm in the city, fought with desperate ferocity and bravery, attempting to prove they were more than just parade ground soldiers. Knowing a Vitellian victory meant their disbandment. But they were crushed by the sheer weight, tactical superiority, and cohesive discipline of the frontier legions. In the chaotic marshes of the Po Valley, the grim reality of legionary warfare overwhelmed the Praetorian cohorts, not by superior courage, but by the sheer grinding weight of veteran experience. The Praetorians had grown fat on bribes within the walls of Rome, while the frontier legions had been forged in the crucible of constant war. By nightfall, 40,000 Roman citizens lay dead or dying in the marshes of the Po River, their armor sinking into the silt. The news reached Otho's camp at Brixellum the next morning. His soldiers, weeping and fiercely loyal, drew their swords and begged him to lead them again to fight to the last man. But Otho, the former decadent playboy who used to bathe in donkey milk, found a sudden iron resolve. He looked at his men and spoke with a calm that terrified them more than his anger ever had, telling them that one winter of civil war was enough and that he would not buy his life with another drop of Roman blood. That night, he burned his personal letters to protect his friends from the wrath of the victor, distributed his money to his servants, and slept soundly for hours. At dawn, he took a single dagger and fell upon it. His funeral was rushed, as he had ordered, but his memory lingered. He had lived like a villain, but died like a true Roman. With Otho dead, the road to the capital lay open, undefenseless against the approaching storm. Vitellius marched toward Rome not as a savior, but as a conqueror entering a captured city. Vitellius did not govern the empire. He consumed it. Historians record that in his brief reign, he spent 900 million sesterces on banquets alone. He famously invented a dish called the Shield of Minerva, a grotesque blend of pike livers, pheasant brains, and flamingo tongues, ingredients shipped from the ends of the earth while the treasury bled dry. To make room for more, he would induce vomiting between courses. The corridors of the Palatine, once the austere home of Augustus, now reeked of stale wine, exotic spices, and the sweat of sycophants. Outside the banquet halls, the grim discipline of the Rhine legions evaporated in the Roman summer. His soldiers, once the terror of the Germanic tribes, turned into an armed mob, billeting themselves in temples and brothels. They grew soft, their iron discipline dissolving in the heat and vice of the capital, turning the city into a chaotic barracks where no citizen was safe from a drunk legionary's whim. Although Vitellius temporarily disbanded the Praetorian Guard, the institution was too deeply entrenched to die, surviving the civil war even as its dignity rotted. But while Vitellius feasted on oysters, a different kind of hunger was growing in the east. In the scorching dust of Judea, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, a mule breeder's son turned general, was finishing a brutal war against Jewish rebels. He was a man who slept in his boots and ate soldiers' rations. On July 1st, 69 CE, the legions in Alexandria declared for him, and within days, the armies of Judea and Syria followed. The rot in Rome had not gone unnoticed by the hard men of the frontier. Vitellius laughed off the rumors, trusting in the thousands of miles between Rome and the east, completely unaware that the danger was much closer. Antonius Primus, a rogue commander of the Danube legions with a criminal past and a wolf's instinct for weakness, had pledged loyalty to Vespasian. He wasn't waiting for orders. He was already crossing the Alps, moving with a terrifying speed that would catch the glutton with a cup in his hand. In late October 69 CE, the legions returned to the blood-soaked fields of Bedriacum. The unburied bones of Otho's soldiers still lay in the ditches, bleached white by the summer sun, a grim reminder of the first slaughter. This time, the collision between the Vitellian defenders and the Flavian invaders, led by the ferocious Antonius Primus, did not wait for dawn. The two massive Roman hosts crashed into each other in the pitch black of night. It was a battle fought by ear and touch, a chaotic nightmare where passwords were shouted in the dark, and men grappled with enemies who wore the exact same armor and spoke the exact same Latin dialects. For hours, the line swayed in a deadlock of exhaustion and adrenaline as the heavy infantry pushed shield against shield, slipping in mud and viscera, unable to see the man they were killing. Then, nature played a cruel trick that decided the fate of the empire. The moon rose from the east, directly behind the backs of the Flavian troops. The low, bright light cast the long, distorted shadows of the Flavian soldiers far forward toward the Vitellian lines. The Vitellian artillerymen, squinting through the gloom, were deceived by the optics. Mistaking the long shadows for the actual bodies of the enemy, they adjusted their torsion engines and unleashed a massive volley of bolts and stones. The projectiles hissed through the air and slammed harmlessly into the empty ground, yards short of the Flavian ranks. Seeing the mistake, the Flavian archers stepped forward into the moonlight. With their targets illuminated against the dark western horizon, they poured a withering fire into the confused Vitellian masses, who fell by the hundreds, struck by invisible arrows from the dark. The carnage dragged on until the first hint of gray touched the eastern sky. The 3rd Legion Gallica, veterans of the Syrian frontier, who had embraced the cult of the sun god Elagabalus, stopped fighting for a moment to perform their morning ritual. As the sun crested the horizon, thousands of men turned east and raised a great shout of salutation. The Vitellians, ignorant of this eastern custom, panicked, believing the shout was a greeting to Vespasian's main army arriving as reinforcements. The rumor shattered their morale instantly, and the Vitellian line, which had held through the terror of the night, broke and ran. The road to Rome was now open, but the war was not over. As Vitellius would not leave quietly, he would retreat to the capital and turn the eternal city into a burning pyre. The war had arrived at the heart of the empire, bringing hell with it. As Antonius Primus's army breached the city walls in December 69 CE, Rome dissolved into an atrocity. It was no longer a battle of maneuver. It was a massacre in a theater. The historian Tacitus records a chilling detail. The citizens of Rome, desensitized by decades of gladiatorial games, watched the slaughter from the rooftops and balconies. They cheered and placed bets as soldiers butchered each other in the forum, treating the civil war as a specter provided for their amusement. But the horror deepened when the fighting reached the Capitoline Hill. Flavius Sabinus, Vespasian's older brother, and his young son Domitian had barricaded themselves in the sacred precinct, hoping to hold out until the legions arrived. The Vitellian diehards, realizing their cause was lost, but fueled by desperate rage, laid siege to the Holy Mount and threw torches onto the roofs of the surrounding buildings. The fire, as fed by the dry winter winds, licked up the slopes and caught the ancient cedar beams of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. For the Roman people, this was not just destruction. It was deicide. The temple, which had stood for hundreds of years as the symbol of the Republic's pact with the gods, was consumed. The roar of the flames drowned out the screams of the dying, while molten gold from the roof tiles dripped down the marble columns like tears. In the chaos, Sabinus was captured and hacked to pieces on the Gemonian stairs, his body pierced by 1,000 insults before being tossed into the street. Young Domitian barely escaped, disguised in the linen robes of a priest of Isis, slipping through the smoke like a ghost. When the main Flavian force finally punched through the defenses, the streets were slippery with blood and ash. They hunted the remaining Vitellians through the baths and private houses, killing indiscriminately until the resistance collapsed and the city was taken. Amidst the looting and the smoke, the soldiers searched for the man responsible. Kicking open the doors of the imperial palace, they found the great halls empty, and the servants fled. Vitellius was not on his throne. He was hiding in a porter's lodge, trembling behind a mattress, waiting for the end. Dragged from his hiding place, the Flavian soldiers did not find a ruler, but a trembling, overweight man in a stained tunic. They bound his hands behind his back, placed a noose around his neck, and dragged him half-naked along the Via Sacra like a common criminal. To prevent him from looking down to hide his shame, a soldier held a dagger point under his chin, forcing his face up to meet the gaze of the mob. The people of Rome, who had cheered for him at the games just months before, now hurled dung and mud, mocking his obesity, his gluttony, and his red alcohol-flushed face. It was the ultimate ritual of humiliation, ending with a public lynching. As the blows began to rain down, Vitellius cried out one last, desperate reminder. "Answer me this. Was I not once your emperor?" The mob answered with swords. On the Gemonian stairs, they hacked him into pieces with slow, deliberate cruelty, and when the butchery was over, they dragged what remained of his body with a hook and threw it into the Tiber. The river washed the blood away, swirling it out toward the sea. But the empire that emerged from the water was changed forever. The illusion of the Senate's choice was gone. and the sword now ruled alone. The civil war ended not with a treaty, but with exhaustion. Vespasian, the fourth and final emperor of that terrible year, did not arrive in Rome until months later, bringing with him the dust of Judea and the pragmatism of a mule breeder's son. The 60-year-old bald and notoriously stingy general was exactly what a bankrupt empire needed. To ensure his power was not just a military accident, the Senate passed the Lex de Imperio Vespasiani, a law that coldly listed the powers of the emperor, stripping away the last polite fictions of the Republic. The emperor was now, by law, the master of the state. To heal the scars of the city, Vespasian began a massive building project on the site of Nero's hated Golden House. Using the vast spoils looted from the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, he drained the ornamental lake and laid the foundations for the Flavian amphitheater, the Colosseum. It was a masterstroke of propaganda, giving the land Nero had stolen for his private pleasure back to the people for their public slaughter. The Year of the Four Emperors taught a lesson that would hold for centuries. The legions could make an emperor, but only a soldier could keep the throne. The chaos of 69 CE was finally over, buried under the stone arches of the arena. But the question remained whether the stability of the Flavian dynasty was worth the death of the Republic's last ideals. However, the cancer of the Praetorian Guard had not been excised. A century later, this rot would culminate in an act so shameful it stains Roman history to this day. The year 193 CE began with hope, but ended in one of the most grotesque spectacles in human history. After the Praetorians murdered the disciplinarian Emperor Pertinax for attempting to cap their bonuses, they retreated behind the imposing brick walls of the Castra Praetoria. They did not mourn. They calculated, realizing that their monopoly on violence gave them the ultimate leverage. Locking the gates, they announced to the trembling senators below that the Roman Empire was now an asset to be liquidated, for sale to the highest bidder. Two wealthy men approached the ramparts like merchants at a cattle market. Inside the camp stood Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, the city prefect, desperately trying to buy the soldiers' loyalty to save his own skin. Outside the walls stood Didius Julianus, a fabulously wealthy senator, known more for his banquets than his bravery. What followed was a bidding war that stripped the last shred of dignitas from the Roman state. Sulpicianus shouted his offer of 20,000 sestertii to every soldier, while the guards looked down at Julianus, waiting. Julianus shattered the ceiling, shouting a bid of 25,000 sestertii per man, an equivalent of several years' pay for a single vote. The roar from inside the fortress was deafening, a chaotic mix of greed and triumph, as the soldiers threw open the gates and hailed Julianus as emperor. They protected him not because he was chosen by the gods, but because he was the man who signed the check. But Didius Julianus bought the world only to find that the receipt for that purchase would be delivered by a general marching from the Danube with a vengeance. In June 193 CE, Septimius Severus arrived at the gates of Rome, not as a bidder, but as an executioner. He knew that to rule the empire, he first had to break the weapon that had murdered his predecessor. Severus devised a cunning trap, summoning the entire Praetorian Guard to a gathering on the outskirts of the city, ordering them to leave their heavy arms in the barracks and appear in their ceremonial togas, ostensibly to receive a new accession bonus. The Praetorians, arrogant and accustomed to being courted by emperors, marched out unarmed, expecting gold, but found steel instead. As the thousands of guardsmen assembled, the trap snapped shut, and Severus's Danube legions, battle-hardened soldiers covered in the dust of the frontier, rather than the perfumes of the capital, emerged from concealment, surrounding the ceremonial formation with leveled spears. The tension in the air was suffocating as Severus ascended the tribunal, denouncing their treachery and ordering his legionaries to tear the military belts and silver inlaid daggers from the Praetorians' togas. The silence of the field was broken only by the chaotic clatter of ceremonial weapons being thrown into a pile of shame, the sound of an institution crumbling. Severus spared their lives, but killed their legacy, banishing the old guard and replacing them with his own loyal legionaries. Yet, while Severus had changed the blood of the guard, he had simply replaced one set of armed political arbiters with another, leaving the power intact. It would take one final cataclysmic battle nearly a century later to destroy them for good. By October 28th, 312 CE, the Praetorian Guard faced a threat unlike any assassination plot: the hardened legions of Constantine. They had thrown their support behind the usurper Maxentius, positioning their troops with the Tiber River directly at their backs, a tactical decision that would prove fatal. When the lines collided at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, the disparity between the parade ground soldiers of the capital and Constantine's frontier veterans became immediately apparent. The conscripts on Maxentius's wings crumbled almost instantly, driven back by the disciplined fury of Constantine's cavalry. As the pontoon bridge behind them collapsed under the weight of fleeing soldiers, the retreat turned into a massacre. The sensory reality of this moment was horrific. The brown, churning waters of the Tiber swallowed the defeat. Men in heavy, gilded armor designed to intimidate crowds in the forum sank like stones, their screams stifled by the silt. Maxentius himself drowned in the muck, weighed down by his own imperial regalia. Yet, amidst this chaotic rout, the Praetorians did not run. Historical accounts suggest the guard maintained their formation on the riverbank, out of cold calculation, knowing Constantine would offer no quarter to the political cancer he had come to excise. Trapped between the advancing enemy swords and the deadly current, the Praetorians fought with a suicidal ferocity until they were cut down almost to the last man. Constantine's victory marked the definitive end of the Praetorian Guard. He dismantled the very memory of their power. The survivors were stripped of their status and scattered to the furthest corners of the frontier. Now, while Constantine ordered the demolition of the western wall of the Castra Praetoria, the Scorpion's nest was broken open, leaving the city defenseless against its own emperor, but finally free from the tyranny of its bodyguards. For 3 centuries, the Praetorian Guard stood as the ultimate paradox of Roman power. Established by Augustus to secure the Pax Romana, they instead became the primary engine of its chaos. By proving that the throne could be bought with gold and secured with a dagger, they shattered the illusion of senatorial authority and paved the way for the anarchy that nearly destroyed the empire. The ruins of the Castra Praetoria remain a grim testament to a timeless political truth. In a system where authority rests solely on force, the bodyguards inevitably become the jailers. When the walls were finally torn down, the stones were silent, but the lesson remained that loyalty purchased with coin is not true fides. It is merely a temporary lease on survival. If you want to uncover more secrets of the ancient world, please subscribe to our channel to relive heroic chapters of history with us.